I'm proud of him. I miss him.
He knew God always was with him, no matter what had happened.
I knew that they were boys.
It just wasn't right for African American people to be treated that way. It just wasn't fair and it wasn't right.
Hello, I'm Devin Fehely. The road to justice can be long and treacherous. And that is especially true for more than 200 black sailors wrongfully punished here in the Bay Area during World War II. Now for these men and for their loved ones, there is some justice at last.
Next, I'd like to recognize...
A memorial service was held in Concord marking 80 years since the largest military disaster on U.S. soil during World War II.
The explosion of 2 munition ships in San Francisco Bay shocks the world.
Well, you think back 80 years ago, the extraordinary disaster that happened here.
The ceremony took place on the very site where 320 men lost their lives, most of the dead young black sailors who loaded ordnance on ships with little training.
There were people from the Merchant Marines and the Coast Guard and other places that had offered to train the men to load the munitions properly. They were not even provided gloves.
After the blast, the surviving sailors were ordered back to work. 258 refused, citing safety concerns.
The Rear Admiral, he threatened to have each and every one of them shot if they refused to go back to work.
All but 50 complied.
There was 50 guys left, and he was one of those 50.
These sailors became known as the Port Chicago 50. All were convicted of mutiny, sentenced to hard labor in prison, and given dishonorable discharges. Now, 80 years later, they have all been exonerated.
To see that come together with the mere stroke of a pen to undo all of that injustice, very powerful moment.
How did we get here? Our journey begins early morning in 1941 at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Ann Makovic reports.
On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the most important American naval base in the Pacific and home to the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
Most every ship in the harbor has been hit.
The attack was devastating. More than 2,400 Americans died, and nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships, were destroyed or damaged.
Within the House, there is applause.
Following day, then U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Congress agreed, and the U.S. entered World War II.
The U.S. Navy needed a new strategic location to transfer and load munitions bound for the Pacific. It found the perfect spot in the Bay Area. Mare Island Naval Shipyard near Vallejo was at capacity. So the U.S. Navy decided to build a new munitions transfer facility near the small town of Port Chicago in Contra Costa County. The site was ideal. It could handle ocean-bound ships and was connected to 3 major railroads. Trains would deliver the munitions, and then workers would load the explosives directly into seagoing vessels or barges. At Mare Island, unionized civilian dock workers loaded the explosives, but at Port Chicago, the U.S. Navy chose a different path. Elizabeth Cook explains.
He was a family man.
They were sons, husbands, fathers.
I always asked Pops, what did you do in the war? And he would never tell us.
And they start telling these war stories, and Uncle Irvin would get really angry.
Young black sailors who loved their country.
My dad wanted to join the military to fight for our country.
Dad enlisted because both of his brothers were in the Army, and he felt that he had an obligation to support and defend his country as well.
Yeah, it was in his first year. It had to be within his first year.
Carol Cherry, Daryl Meeks, Spencer Sykes, the Reverend Diana McDaniel.
And this is Morris and Ursula Sublé.
And Richard Sublé. The 5 share a common bond. Their loved ones were among the more than 1,400 black sailors stationed at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine. Most were in their teens and early 20s.
He was young. I mean, he enlisted at 17 years of age.
He was just 20 years old.
He was approximately 23 years old at the time that he was at Port Chicago.
The black sailors went through basic training, hoping to fight the enemy on the front lines, but they were barred from combat roles. At Port Chicago, they were assigned the most dangerous job, the loading of munitions.
And Pop, he says, they got all of us together and they just dumped us down there to load these ships. He says there were no white guys out there doing it. It was just the black guys.
The Navy decided on using enlisted sailors instead of unionized civilians in order to lower the cost and enhance security. The problem, as Morris Sublé told his son, no one was trained.
Well, my dad told me that no one ever told them or taught them how to load the ammunition. And in addition to that, the officers and the people who were trying to lead them knew nothing about loading ammunition. So everything that they did was by trial and error. So it was a very dangerous job.
White officers supervised them. At that time, the Navy was segregated.
This was a time of worse Jim Crow laws than ever.
Reverend Diana McDaniel is minister of the Unity Church of San Leandro. Her uncle was also stationed at Port Chicago. He and the other black sailors lived in segregated barracks and used segregated facilities.
Here these guys were loading munitions on ships. They were not able to go to the bathroom on the same ships that they were loading.
Spencer Sykes Sr. told his son,
when he had to use the restroom, he wasn't allowed to use the restroom on the ship. He had to walk a half a mile down the road to relieve himself. Imagine that.
At Port Chicago, the work went on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Against standard safety procedures, 2 ships were loaded at one pier. Reports reveal how the U.S. Coast Guard warned the Navy that the conditions were dangerous. Carol's dad, Cyril Shepard, grew concerned.
He talked about these big bombs you can't get your arms around. And he says, and these guys weren't trained. He says, all you can hear is bam, bam. He says, can't you do any better than that? And they were like, well, these bombs don't have detonators. And he was like, well, it has TNT.
The unionized dock workers offered to train the sailors, but the Navy reportedly turned them down, believing it would slow down the work. Daryl's dad, Freddie, told him the sailors felt pressured to pick up the pace.
The white officers placed bets on which crew could load the most ammunition on the ships fastest. And they were under that type of pressure. They referred to it, the sailors referred to it as slave conditions.
Sooner than later, a catastrophe was bound to happen.
The Navy built the Port Chicago facility in under a year. It would take just seconds to devastate it. Coming up, the blast that would lead to the largest mutiny trial in U.S. Navy history. Welcome back to Port Chicago, justice at last. For the black sailors at Port Chicago on a cool, clear, moonless night, in just seconds, life would change forever. The date, July 17th, 1944. Here's Juliette Goodrich.
The Stars and Stripes, an enduring symbol of freedom and justice, flies over a national memorial near Suisun Bay. Right offshore, the remains of a wooden pier, a grim reminder of a catastrophic disaster.
The earth-shaking explosion happened at night.
We thought it was an earthquake because we live in earthquake country.
Betty Reed Soskin, a retired ranger with the National Park Service, was just 23 years old when a powerful blast woke her up.
We didn't know what it was.
Earlier in the day, Betty and her husband had hosted some of the black sailors from Port Chicago before their night shift began.
They got back in their Jeeps and went off.
At Port Chicago, tied to the loading pier, 2 cargo ships, the brand new SS Quinault Victory and the SSEA Bryan. The black sailors had packed the Bryan with more than 4,600 tons of munitions, including nearly 2,000 tons of high explosives.
The explosion of
At 10:18 p.m., 2 massive explosions, 5 seconds apart.
He was reading a letter from home when the explosions happened.
The blast instantly killed 320 men, most of them black sailors. It injured more than 400 others.
It blew them throughout the entire barracks. It blew men through the windows. It blew my dad back into the locker room. It was just horrendous.
The white officers were sent home on extended leave to recover from the trauma. The black sailors were sent back to the docks to recover human remains.
My dad specifically told me the story where they were sent back to clean up the mess, the carnage, the aftermath. And I remember him telling stories about how he picked up a shoe that still had a foot in it.
Soon, the black sailors were ordered back to loading munitions on Mare Island. In a state of shock, 258 refused, fearing another explosion and citing safety concerns. A rear admiral threatened to have them all shot on sight. All but 50 complied.
The 50, they stood together and they said, kill us, but we're not going to continue to work under these conditions.
Among them, Cyril Shepard and Freddie Meeks. They would soon belong to the Port Chicago 50.
The exact cause of the Port Chicago explosion has never been determined. The Port Chicago 50 were willing to obey all other orders. They just refused to load more explosives without the proper training. The Navy's response, punishment. Here's Ryan Yamamoto.
It was the largest mutiny trial in U.S. naval history, held 2 months after the disaster. 50 young black sailors facing a panel of 7 white naval officers. Cyril Shepard, one of the 50, was astounded.
You hear him say mutiny and that they were guilty. He says he almost fell to the ground because he was shocked that his country would even do that to him.
The court-martial was held on Treasure Island and lasted 6 weeks. Future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall attended, observing the proceedings as a civil rights attorney for the NAACP.
He couldn't represent them because it was a military trial.
The Port Chicago 50 were tried together and defended by Navy lawyers, 1 attorney for every 10 men, denying the black sailors a meaningful right to counsel.
Resources that were afforded to the white sailors that weren't afforded to them.
In addition, the judges allowed hearsay against the sailors. They also refused to admit any evidence of the unsafe working conditions at Port Chicago. Richard Sublay's father, Morris, was not on trial, but he was horrified at the Navy's actions.
We thought it was unfair because none of us deserved being placed in harm's way as we were on American soil.
The judges deliberated for 80 minutes and found all 50 black sailors guilty. They received up to 15 years confinement at hard labor, the total forfeiture of their pay, and dishonorable discharges.
Finding them guilty of mutiny was a wrongdoing as far as I'm concerned, and they should be perceived as heroes, not as mutineers.
As for the more than 200 other sailors who complied, they too were punished. A summary court-martial sentenced them to a bad conduct discharge and a loss of pay. Coming up, what happened following those verdicts? Welcome back. The Port Chicago Mutiny trial was a seminal moment for the civil rights movement. It brought attention to the mistreatment of the black sailors and thrust the Navy under the spotlight. Kara St. Cyr explains.
During the mutiny trial, Thurgood Marshall, the chief legal counsel of the NAACP, declared it was not the Port Chicago 50 on trial, but the Navy itself.
Once the trial was over, he fought for them.
Marshall drove the campaign to appeal the convictions and to release the sailors.
Thurgood Marshall came in, and President Roosevelt's wife, in her writing and petitioning.
Supporting Marshall's efforts, then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt.
And therefore I have never felt.
Mrs. Roosevelt contacted then U.S. Naval Secretary James Forrestal and put pressure on him to set the sailors free. While their efforts failed, they shed a bright light on the unethical, racist treatment of the sailors.
To think that it's taken so long for a wrong to be righted.
The war ended in 1945. By 1946, the Navy officially ended segregation, and the Port Chicago 50 were released, but not a single one was exonerated.
When the Port Chicago 50 returned home, they were denied the benefits provided to other World War II vets: college tuition, unemployment insurance, and housing. Many ended up keeping their past hidden even from their loved ones. Here's Reed Cowan.
The hurt that he felt, he and my mother, Eleanor, they never talked about this incident, ever.
Why didn't I hear about it? How could I go through school and never hear about this situation? I don't even know how to put it into words.
Carol Cherry and Daryl Meeks share a quest. They're determined to honor their late fathers by telling their stories and clearing their names.
These guys were mistreated from the first day, and they deserve honor.
That exoneration would state that this is a principle of this country. Doing what's right, treating everyone equally and fairly.
Daryl grew up not knowing what his father did during the war. His dad, Freddie, refused to talk about it. But then one day, Daryl dropped by his parents' home, opened the door, and saw his pops sitting on the sofa.
He was crying. First time I had ever seen my father cry.
It was then Daryl learned about Port Chicago, the explosion, the carnage, and his father's mutiny trial.
To me, it left me speechless to understand what he went through, and to see my father cry told me how difficult that was to relive that.
To know that at 20 years old, he's out there and, 300 and some people lose their lives. And then now he has to go out there and clean up all of this debris. And he has to look at the pieces of bodies.
For Carol, she found out about her father's past after he died. Like Freddie, Cyril Shepard was part of the Port Chicago 50. Her older half-sister Pam told her.
But I was so glad she shared it because he had never shared it. And so we talked about
Carol then dug into the history to understand
this was the NAACP article.
What happened to her father?
I've done a lot of research.
Carol tracked down her father's military records, which include these notations on the trial. She scoured online databases, transcripts, and interviews, everything she could get her hands on.
The more I knew, the more I wanted to know, and I'm still discovering.
As for Daryl, Freddie finally opened up and told his son everything. Following the verdict, he said all 50 men were loaded into cattle cars and by railway shipped to Terminal Island Federal Prison in San Pedro.
They were shipped down in animal boxcars. No seats, no restroom facilities, boxcars used to transport animals.
Once incarcerated, the degrading treatment continued.
And those military officers that were guarding them had them crawl daily, Pops talked about, on their knees, picking up cigarette butts out in the prison yard.
Following the explosion, an investigation exonerated the white officers of any responsibility. Now, the descendants of the black sailors are seeking nothing less than an exoneration for their loved ones.
He's our hero because he stood with those 50, those other 49 sailors. They stood for what was right.
And I want my children to be proud of what he's done.
Over the years, groups like the Friends of the Port Chicago National Memorial have pushed to exonerate the sailors. Several lawmakers have also tried to pass legislation, including U.S. Congressman Mark DeSaulnier of Concord.
We know from the historical record that there was no attempt to overthrow the authority and mutiny as defined by the Department of Defense legal statutes.
Here's a letter from Secretary today.
Up next, justice arrives at the front door. Earlier, we told you that the road to justice can be long and treacherous. In this case, it took 80 years, the stroke of a pen, and a knock at the door. Brian Hackney reports.
At the Golden Gate National Cemetery, 44 unknown black sailors are buried. They're among the 320 men who died in the horrible explosion at Port Chicago. Now, exactly 80 years after the disaster,
Here's a letter from Secretary today.
justice finally arrived. An official order of full exoneration hand-delivered by the U.S. Navy. Among those who received it, the son of the late Freddie Meeks.
Kudos to the Navy for getting it right.
And the daughter of the late Cyril Shepard.
Took a few generations to get it right, but we're so happy they did.
All the black sailors, unjustly punished, were exonerated by the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro.
It is shocking, and obviously it was a different time in our country's history when there was much discrimination.
The Navy conducted a thorough investigation and determined all the court-martials were unfair, riddled with legal errors, and tainted with discrimination.
I think people were looking to be able to accuse them of something, whether it was wrongdoing or whether disobeying an order or whether it was mutiny itself.
Secretary del Toro signed the order in front of the son of the late Thurgood Marshall and the granddaughter of the late Eleanor Roosevelt.
When it comes down to it, what the Secretary of the Navy did reflects not only his courage and dedication and commitment to integrity, but very hard work of the lawyers in his office and also the local bar association here.
It also reflects the integrity of black sailors who stood up for what's right.
It's about the lineage of the Meeks family and 200 plus families moving forward and ultimately being exonerated for standing up for what's right.
The Navy is trying to identify the families of all the exonerated black sailors. We posted the names of all the defendants on our website. And if you're related, a way that you can reach out to the Navy. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the arc of the moral universe is long but bends towards justice. Well, the Port Chicago 50 are no longer with us. There's finally some justice at last. Thanks for joining us. I'm Devin Fehely.